Well, you see that loads now, don't you? There's unfortunately, it's not rare anymore for shamans to sexually abuse during ayahuasca ceremonies. I mean, it is rare, but it's not as uncommon as you'd like to think that it is. And I mean, I think a lot of the people who are doing that, a lot of the shamans and the curanderos who are doing that, maybe have questionable training, but I'm sure that some of them, they are probably quite powerful and do have adequate training, and are just making bad mistakes and are human. I think there's definitely a temptation for people to put shamans and curanderos on a pedestal, that they're these almost guru-like people, and they're not. They're another form of healer, the equivalent of a doctor, a traditional doctor.
Yeah, because this guy Alain de Botton, he's a Swiss philosopher. He talks about that he doesn't trust those kind of gurus or teachers or whoever, you want to think they are the leaders, who does not reveal their clay feats, like the issues they have. Because as a human, whatever stage of enlightenment you get into, there's always these kind of scenarios where you'd be like, oh yeah, of course, your guru breaks your heart, which I think is a really good perspective, because he talks about, he's written so many books, and like Art of Travel and all, and many books about emotions and emotional robustness, and still he said, you must see me sometime at an airport with my suitcases and like crying and being frustrated. But he says that, you should embrace it as part of humanity. And yeah, we do have a lot of this tendencies of putting people on the pedestal. So Simon, this time, hopefully I won't get your second name wrong.
Famous last words, right?
Yes. So last time, so Simon is a doctor. He's working with NHS. So you also work with a lot of psychotherapy situations, which is going on right now. But tell me, how would you introduce yourself?
So I normally say that I'm a psychiatric doctor, working in the NHS, and I also do research into psychedelics, namely ayahuasca.
So last time we finished our conversation on trauma, especially childhood trauma, you said it would be interesting to look more into that scenario. And I think what we just talked about even people who are really, we think, are enlightened, and they are enlightened, still there is a lot of abuse which comes from them. And I think,
yeah, for sure,
I think this is another indicator of how much trauma there exists in our society. No matter if you become so much more aware and grown up, still there are some aspects of those traumas which work around you.
For sure. I think one of the first things to say about childhood trauma is that there's far more of it than we know. And so it was a while ago now, in the 90s, there was a study called the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Event Study, and they were looking at the amount of childhood trauma that took place in the United States. And previous to this, I think the estimates were extremely low. Maybe 2% of the population are abused as children. And as a result of this study, they found out that actually the results were far higher. I mean, the actual statistics escape my mind now, but it was roughly 1/3 of the US population had experienced childhood trauma, which is a phenomenally high amount. So that's one of the reasons that when we were doing our current study that we're finishing off now, we were looking at the degree of childhood trauma that people had experienced, and we weren't bringing in people specifically who had experienced childhood trauma. We were assessing the amount of childhood trauma from a sample of people who were coming to the research centre in the jungle. And so, yeah, we had varying degrees of childhood trauma. Obviously, some people who had experienced horrendous things, and other people who had experienced pretty much no childhood trauma. But everyone was on a scale. I think, most people have experienced some kind of trauma or childhood trauma throughout their life.
And this is good that we should get this maybe phenomena explained in this way, that you were talking about that even though the shamans or the curanderos get, so shamans are people who are working in these societies who generally, just to give a brief description, or curanderos I think is a Spanish word for
yeah. So I think there are many different words for traditional healers depending on what they're actually doing. So the curanderos, that's the word that's used for traditional healers working with plants in the Amazon rainforest. Shamans is normally reserved for people working in the Andes with slightly different plant medicine, and then you have vegetalismo, who are people who work more specifically making different plant medicines again in the jungle. But there are many different ways. I think quite often in Western society we use this blanket term shaman, which isn't technically correct, but most people know what you're talking about when you say shaman.
Okay, so what are the distinction about what are the plants shamans work with, or what is the distinction?
So yeah, I mean the plants differ depending on the geographical location of the traditional healer. Ayahuasca specifically, I mean, many different people use ayahuasca. For our research, we work with the curanderos.
Okay, so just to bring back and get into the perspective, you talk about trauma, and that might be one of the reasons why it's so shocking sometimes when we hear that, oh my goodness, these people who are healer themselves are giving trauma by sexually abusing a lot of their patients. And this is a topic which many people refrain because it's already something which when I say this, I mean healing or psychotherapy through psychedelic plants is something already not that acceptable, and everyone is working so hard to bring these methods, and when you hear something like that, you'd be like, oh, maybe this is damaging. But I think it would be interesting to understand this phenomena in broader context of what you said. Nearly every person you might have experienced trauma, so it does make sense that even though you are working as someone who is essentially be more aware of the situation and themselves, but still somehow that trauma is so strong that still represent in some way. So it's good to get the negative aspects out of at first, before we get into the conversation, before we talk more about the healing aspects. I think even though it's a very difficult conversation to have, but it's good that we talked about it before on.
Yeah, for sure. I think that any kind of sexual abuse that's happening in ayahuasca circles, or I mean any kind of sexual abuse that's happening anywhere, obviously is is far too much. But there's something particularly wrong about that kind of abuse happening in ayahuasca circles for a variety of reasons. It's not exclusively, but it's normally fairly young females that are targeted, and horrendously, quite often, these are people who have come to the ayahuasca ceremonies in order to heal trauma, sometimes of a sexual nature. Yeah, I mean, and that's before you begin to even think about the vulnerable state that you're in when you're in the psychedelic experience. And so you can certainly do a lot of damage. I think one of the reasons why this is an issue at the moment is the lack of regulation surrounding the use of ayahuasca. So unlike in with Western style doctors, where you have to have you have to have a degree, and then you have to finish med school, and then you have to have trained for however many years, and so then you have this stamp that proves that you are a medical doctor. You don't have that in the jungle. There's pretty much no regulation. And so if you go to Peru and you go to Iquitos, which is one of the main places that ayahuasca tourism is present, when you get off the plane, every other person is saying that they're hosting ceremonies, that they work as a shaman. And so how do you know? Now, there is no regulation. And so actually there's a group called Shakruna, which is led by a really great ayahuasca researcher called Bia Labache, and she's written some guidelines together with some other members of Shakruna, and they outline steps that you can take if you're new or if you're more experienced to the ayahuasca world, in order to try and avoid getting into situations where you might be particularly vulnerable.
This question has come a lot, which is that, okay, so if you or anyone wants to go and go through this ceremony, what is the way that they can find someone who is trustworthy? And it's a hard job, as you're saying, but always the answer I hear, and please expand on that, and if there is a better way, because I didn't know about this guideline, that they say that, there is actually, it's a hard thing to know. You should just ask the people who were in the ceremony, or anyone who has gone through the ceremonies, ask their testimony, ask them, and that's how you find out about if the person was good, or what effects they got out of it, and how was it. There isn't any other way of finding out. But if you have something more to explain, or to guide maybe those people who are, because I'm sure there is a lot of people who at this point are trying to go there, but they just don't know who to contact, how to contact, and what are the procedures.
Yeah, I mean that's a tricky one. So I get asked this quite a lot, obviously because I work as a psychiatric doctor and do research into mainly ayahuasca, and so I can't recommend that anyone goes to a particular place. But at the same time, I think that if you were searching for a retreat center to go to, I definitely wouldn't just go to Iquitos and, after meeting the first person on the street, go with them. Most of these retreat centers have websites, and you can look at kind of testimonies from there, speak to other people who have who have drunk ayahuasca in different circles, and most of these places, most of the big ones, they begin to get a reputation, so you know what they're about. But I think going to somewhere reputable is it's essential. It's really essential. But yeah, I think this is probably quite a good time as well to kind of talk about some of the risks that can come with ayahuasca, too, because I think there's a bit of a danger with ayahuasca that you can begin to think, it's this panacea that treats everything, and Western medicine is rubbish, and it's all about traditional, and it's all about plant medicines, and I think there are a lot of shortfalls with Western medicine, but there are also a lot of great things about it too, especially I think that's especially the case with psychiatry. But when it comes to using psychedelics in a medicinal setting, you have to be very careful with the risk of psychosis. And so this means if you suffer from any conditions that might lead to psychosis, you need to be very careful. And the classic ones are kind of schizophrenia and personality disorders as well, like borderline personality disorder. So emotionally unstable personality disorder is the most common. Now the tricky part comes if you don't know that you're predisposed to one of these conditions. So we would say that you're predisposed to a psychotic disorder if somebody in your family, for example, had a psychotic disorder. But if you were adopted, you might not know that actually your parents suffer from psychosis, and it would be a really unfortunate time to find out when you were in a retreat.
Okay, so this brings a very interesting perspective. So it's two conversation I wanted to have, and it's good that you're here.
Thanks.
Yeah. I was thinking about that on Francois Boutsard. I butchered the name completely. she's very well-renowned psychotherapist who use psychedelics and work with many different plants. And the question asked to her was that, okay, so who should not maybe take psychedelics and who should take psychedelics? And yes, the answer was okay, yeah, well, these very basic scenarios of predispositions and schizophrenia and multiple personality disorders and all these things, and which is of course great. But then for some reason there's another maybe more nuanced way of sometimes I've heard where there's further categories even in these situations where it might depend on the scenario where the person actually is coming from, that sometimes these things can help if they are aware of this situation and the person who is leading that ceremony is maybe also aware of it and actually is going into whatever plant they are taking, maybe a disassociated, maybe a ketamine or something else maybe. So I understand you're talking about particularly ayahuasca, and that was a very generic question about just overall psychedelics, which can give you visions and take you to the journey. But the question which I want to discuss with you is that if you say further what type of a person, and there are people who are willing to take an experience and come out the other way not being them, just essentially, and they are comfortable with being. And this is a very generic personality test, so I'm basing it in as much as on our current understanding of empirical psychological psychiatric studies. And so they would say, okay, yeah, well, they are comfortable with abstractions and not being definitive answers, and that doesn't drive them mad, and they can hold these kind of abstraction, unsolved answer subjectively and also about the world for a longer time. And some people are like really jittery and they want to get an answer, and they would get an answer even though they realize that it might not be, but they would want to keep that. I think with that question, don't you think like this goes deeper to the actual fundamental type of human beings there are? I think there is a question now when the psychedelics are getting more popular, we might also need to ask this question.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel that I should probably put a disclaimer on everything that I'm saying this is from a Western scientific kind of medical point of view, or from at least my interpretation of that. And so when I'm saying, oh yeah, you should be avoiding psychedelics if you have schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, that's what we do in our research. I've heard of accounts in the jungle where people with what I would think of as psychosis have gone to curanderos and they've drunk ayahuasca, and what I've been told is that they've had remarkable transformations. But I think a lot of that comes down definitely to the person, for sure. And I mean, what even is schizophrenia? It's an umbrella term that encompasses, a bunch of symptoms that fit criteria for diagnosis. And so, yeah, definitely the person is of the kind of the paramount importance, but also your perception of what it is that's going on there. And so when when we say psychosis, one of the the most kind of reductionist biological way of thinking about that is disruption in the level of chemicals in your brain, for example dopamine, which leads to alterations in perception. But that's not how the shamans and the curanderos view it at all. I don't want to speak for them, but their way of thinking, from what I understand, would be far more along the lines of interaction with some negative energy that needs to be kind of released or dealt with in a very different way to the way that we deal with psychosis, which would be to block certain chemicals. And so I think if you're thinking about it from a different paradigm, then suddenly your ideas about treatment drastically changes. And so from my point of view, in the studies that we do, we in all of the studies looking at psilocybin, whether it be at King's College London, the ones that I work on, or at Imperial or the Johns Hopkins or wherever, there's strict criteria where you screen out anyone with psychosis and bipolar disorder and personality disorder. In the jungle, I think it's up to you to speak to the shaman about it and to decide between you whether or not they think they can help you and whether or not you think that's good for you. So it's a completely different ball game, and one that maybe in years to come we'll see psychedelics being used to help some conditions that right now we're not really sure about. But at the same time, I'd be very cautious. I wouldn't go there treating potentially the conditions that can lead to psychosis with psychedelics when we haven't even fully established whether or not psychedelics can help with your basic conditions like depression and anxiety. We have evidence that suggests that, but we don't know that, So I think get the basics in place first, and then you can begin to get more adventurous with everything.
100%. Skepticism is being careful in this scenario is an accurate response, and we should definitely not encourage anyone with this condition known, and we should be definitely careful about it. You hit the nail, actually. That's perfect. But also, as these psychedelics go into wider public, I would say, the accessibility would improve, hopefully, with FDA approving different various treatments. It would be a conversation to have that just even people don't have condition, but still if people who, again, same thing. We're not saying that it's for everyone. No one is saying that everyone should go and do it. They're brilliant, or everyone who's ill should be treated by that again. But if the curiosity would grow up as it is growing up, I think it's still a conversation to have, that even if you don't have conditions, but whatever is your own personality type, in a way of whatever experiences you have, and what kind of people let's say you don't have any disease, and we're talking about just taking psychedelics for the sake of exploration of your own consciousness. And for some reason, when someone asks, who should and who should not take psychedelics, it's deeply personal. There is no recommendations, but it's the same way that, okay, so psychedelics are illegal, but you can't, recommend everyone to do it, but at least you can put safety methods out there so that people would take it anyway, or won't take it, whatever their decision is. At least they are safe. And I think when the accessibility and the curiosity level gets higher and the FDA actually approves it, I think when people are curious and they are about to go and take it, and I'm talking about no one with the diseases or anything, but just generally exploring consciousness, let's say going for 5-gram psilocybin mushroom heroic dose, that's what they want to explore. If there's a conversation around who should take it or who should not, might inform that, okay, look, I am not comfortable with these kind of scenarios. And fundamentally, I have a view of this world like that. How much preparation I first need in my own sober, without any kind of planned life, to actually go and have this experience and not get uh, shattered by it so much that it then takes a fully trained, experienced person to then put you back and guide you. Because the scenario we're talking about is not going to be the one where, the psychedelics are not accessible and you have to get to, someone like you who understands it. And then, yes, you would screen them out. But this conversation somehow, this question makes me feel that, okay, we are moving towards that. Hopefully, if you guys do your job right and you do screen
No pressure.
yeah, you do screen everyone right now, and so hopefully people are free to choose. Then this question would not be based on, oh, you have schizophrenia, you have, because now well people are taking it. So now the question needs to be very different than the one we have. I don't know, what do you
Yeah, I think it would be, probably fairly similar to psychotherapy without psychedelics, where many people who go to psychotherapy are trying to, I don't want to use the word treat. I think with psychiatry, it's quite, we have to be careful with using, but definitely words like cure and even words like treat. But they're trying to have some insights and to help themselves in relation to particular conditions. But then again, psychotherapy is a great thing to do to understand yourself better, even if you don't have anything in particular that you're trying to figure out as such. Plus, I think that everyone always has something they can work on, and if you don't think you have anything that you need to work on, then you probably should go to psychotherapy, because that's probably what you need to work on. And I think with psychedelics, we'll probably begin to see a similar kind of pattern. When it comes, I think the word that you used was, how do you do enough preparation so you don't shatter yourself? And this is, that's a really interesting one, because in the trials at King's, sometimes we get asked during the screening, oh, but what happens if we have a bad time? What's the chances of having a bad trip? And I always kind of think, well, like, what is a bad trip? Like what makes it bad? Is it if you have a good time, if I have a bad time, sorry, or you shatter yourself? Because I think that you can have a good time and it can be transformative, but also you can have a very challenging time, and those can be some of the most transformative. And it might be a very, very difficult and challenging 6 hours, but then you can come out the other side with knowledge and acceptance and a real growth from the experience that's priceless. I think trying to avoid any really negative consequences, like developing psychosis or potential re-traumatization, but that in itself is controversial, would definitely be key. But for the majority of the clinical studies that we have where we're using psychedelics as a potential medicine, what we normally do is 3 sessions of preparatory psychotherapy and 3 sessions of integration, which is good. More is always better, but it depends on realistic time and finances, of course.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. There is definitely, well, there is one aspect of where people would question about, and I'm talking about bad trips specifically. When you say what is the bad trip, and I'm talking about people who are understanding and have worked with these medicines for a long time, and that you would hear them say that, well, the bad trip might be the thing which you needed at that point, because of the level of resistance you had, or the same level of patterns which were keeping you there, and that's why the resistance is bringing the bad trip rather than the bad trip itself is a problem. And if you have someone with you who can completely integrate that kind of an experience and reframe that, it would help you a lot. Although I agree with you that, if there isn't anyone like that, and then yes, you do there are some experiences, or maybe, I mean, I don't know, what do you think? I mean, there are there at some experiences at some places where you do through these kind of trips which you take, which could become more it's a tricky word. I don't want to use something negative because I want to keep it open, but yeah, there is a tendency at some point that some trip which you would take would make you more disconnected, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's definitely people have fears around. When you say the word disconnected, the thing again that comes to mind is the kind of the loss of contact with reality, which some people would say could be one way to talk about psychosis. Having abnormalities in the way that you perceive the world. And so I think that's something that we need to really kind of to screen against massively. I think as well, we can't underestimate the importance of integration, because I certainly know, I've heard of people and people that have come to me and spoken to me about experiencing anxiety following the use of psychedelic substances. And I think that integration, which is the process of sitting down with a psychotherapist after the psychedelic session and talking about what happened and how it made you feel and what it meant for you and what you can learn about it, is essential. And I think there is that danger, especially with recreational use, that you take something at a music festival. You lose all your friends, it starts raining, you bump into your ex-girlfriends, and you have this horrendous time, and you just never speak to anyone about it, anything that came up. And I think that definitely can result in anxiety. And so I think that having the appropriate support before and after, as well as during, obviously with the set and setting, which is the mindset and where you do it, is of vital importance, so that you don't, or you can minimize the chances as much as possible of having these more negative outcomes.
Brilliant. So I want to come to the second part of what conversation I wanted to have. Eric Weinstein, I think he's a mathematician, interesting guy. He talks about that sometimes I think a lot of the conversation we have in public domain, when we hear, a statement, there are generally two ways of interpreting them. But and one of them is that the statement is that whale is a fish. So so you say, the person is like not really aware that the whale is a mammal, if I'm correct. Is whale a mammal, if I'm correct? I'm using this right example. Yeah. Okay.
So.
Well, let's just say whatever is a mammal you're talking about. I think whale is a mammal, definitely. So they say, oh yeah, whale is a fish, and they would be like, oh well, not really. Let me correct you. It's a mammal. But we don't know if the person is talking about from a point of view of a very deep knowledge of the evolutionary aspect of a mammal, which have now turned into a fish, but not from a very arbitrary perspective of something which is in a water and is a fish. So do you see, like, these are these parallels? So you can dismiss people on just being the surface statement. So I was listening to Hamilton Morris, and you are right, you mentioned it, that this all observation is from a Western philosophy. And you did mention that now we might think, because maybe most of the listeners, or maybe someone who's listening for the first time, maybe is already aware that that our imperialistic models are very much denying anything which is out of civilization. So we call them uncivilized and dismiss it. It's very self-centered approach. But then we can go on the other side and be like, oh yes, everything which is Western medicine has done is like bullshit, and then everything has to be done in the plants and in the trees. So So this is a very interesting perspective, because no matter what you are talking about, it's a very hard one to discern. Because if you're saying about, hey, be careful, there is some value in this. So the person would be like, imperialistic understanding of the world, and let's just dismiss it. And if you are be like, all the plants ones, you might be thinking maybe also from the careful perspective which you just brought up, that hey, let's make it more balanced approach and understand where some things are valuable, where are not. And he mentioned, Hamilton Morris, about, it's brilliant that, we have a lot to learn from native culture, and respecting that. And once you have truly accepted it, and I think it's a very long journey of self-reflection and understanding where our perspectives come from, how our culture and ourself and our egos have constantly told us the story of self-superiority. But once, hopefully, maybe, we are all on this journey all the time, but once you are taking it and you have understood this perspective, yes, there is so much more to learn from native places. But he says something interesting, and that's what I wanted to mention it, that but still, no culture has got it 100% right. So you shouldn't just make it as if that's exactly how we should do it. We're still discovering, we are still finding it out. So
yeah, for sure. And I think the kind of a good example of this is, so the last time that I was in the jungle, we were working with the curandero, and he was using plant medicines to treat all kinds of things, loads of stuff, and one of my friends got this infection. And he treated it a little bit, with some plant medicine, but it wasn't, the infection was quite severe. And so he was just like, no, you need antibiotics for this. You go to town and you get antibiotics. And we were quite taken aback, because we kind of thought, well, this is a plant medicine research center. This is what, you can't just tell us to go and get antibiotics. Like, what are you talking about? And he was like, oh no, yeah, we use antibiotics for this. That's the most effective way of doing it. And I think it was surprising, but it kind of made me think, fair enough. You're kind of just like, we look at evidence in kind of traditional Western medicine, and we can, what's the most effective? Right, this is the most effective, therefore we use this. It was quite refreshing for me that this curandero had this array of plant medicines, and for this particular condition, he used antibiotics because that's the most effective thing. And to a certain degree, I think perhaps we're beginning to do that in the West as well, where we have all of our treatments and our therapies, and we don't, we haven't had any real new developments in psychiatry, for ages. And so what are we doing? Oh, we're beginning to look at magic mushrooms, or the traditional use of psychedelic compounds like DMT in a traditional framework in the form of ayahuasca. So yeah, I think that for me personally, I find it quite refreshing and appropriate that we have this balance between the two worlds.
Yeah, it's like making the older, whatever mistakes we made, maybe not make it again, and grow up a little bit, which just gives me a lot of genuine happiness around certain areas where well, the psychedelics were, I also thought of it as, at some point when you are learning about it, it's like magical, which they are, but as a complete solution, because again, the role of a medicine in my head was still a pill which works in a way that it fixes you. I mean, the pill's job is not to fix you, like, overall. It's a tool, and that's what I like, that, how he was, that we use different kind of tools to make a human, either heal or make it better, not in a way that it actually becomes a magic stick or a suit which you wear and now you're invisible, but it actually allows you that space or wisdom, or it allows you enough resources for you to actually work on your own self. I mean, ultimately, I mean, we know that that's what you talked about, integration. The reason why integration seems like so important is because you have to do the work after you have taken the trip. The tools are very important. And once we have these different array of tools, it gives us more option to finally, solve tricky, wicked problems. But essentially, that's the kind of, I think, mistake maybe we did with allopathic. We made them, and that's why they were so authoritative, that they were such an effective tool, but we made it maybe as if that's it. It's the Superman pill or Superwoman pill.
Yeah, for sure. I think we touched on this briefly last time about giving the control back to the patient again, where in Western medicine, when you use tablets and pills and surgeries, a key example, you're not even conscious. You just sit there and you take it. We call it an external locus of control. You don't have any control over what's happening to you. And that can be, for some people, you might find it might feel safe to put yourself into someone else's hands, but there's definitely something to be said about taking control over your healing as well, which is very much the approach in the jungle with the curanderos when using ayahuasca. You don't, even when you drink ayahuasca in the ceremony, you drink it and you try your very best to stay sitting up for the 6 hours of the ceremony. It's not something where you lie down and just let it happen to you. You're trying to sit up and to work with it and not to let it to kind of overcome you.
Interesting. This more look like I mean, you're talking about control, and maybe that's why some of the therapies are actually now done by BDSM. You know what I'm talking about?
As in like
I think it's
whips, Burkine.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Because humans are essentially like all the time in different aspects. Well, sex is a very conscious altering experience. I mean, it's one of the very strong ones. It's the oldest one, which has all the life form attached to it. So it's funny that how these kind of themes around therapy play conscious alterness just runs all around it. And I think that is what a complete human being can be, who is not bogged down by traumas, who's not relying completely on these external sources all the time, but actually working with these different tools and working with your own aspect of psyche and whatever that, this is more like a statement about human potential, that we sometimes don't even know or feel what it would be to be a fully healed or complete human at some point. I mean, the very simple example is that when you are, very anxious or depressed state for years, and then suddenly, you go to a retreat or you go to festival, you go to friend, whatever example you want to take, and then suddenly you feel like, I feel like a bit fulfilled. Like, my goodness, like everything feels a bit different. Wait a second, I don't have these paranoid thought all the time, which I was having forever. Wait a second, all the colors seems more brighter. Okay, I feel more, and then suddenly even that voice runs away, and then you are just in the present, just living, and you don't even know what is going on. And whatever you are reading or doing, it's working well. It's a very small example, but I'm sure that these kind of same experiences exist in our untapped potential for being a whole human. So now we are talking about potentiality and trauma, and this is where one of my friends came here, and I was talking about trauma, and he was saying, wait, what, you academics or you researchers or you people who talk about trauma, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by trauma? And it was like, oh, I tried to explain him, and he was like, wait, what do you, isn't that what, like, isn't everyone has trauma? Then what are you talking about? So I think it would be really interesting to maybe talk specifically about trauma, because we talked a lot about how to, cure it and how to heal it, what's going on. We do understand that there's a problem there, but I think that there is something to talk about with the situation in itself, like the meaning of it, and what is the um, scenarios or situations where childhood trauma comes into play, what it is. If someone asks you a question, how do you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. What is trauma? I mean, I think the first thing to say is that trauma can be many different things to many different people, and it's not really up to you whether or not you get traumatized by a certain situation. Trauma comes in many different forms, so you can have physical, emotional, sexual, all of these kinds of trauma as well. What we do know, like we said before, is that trauma, serious trauma, is far more common than we think than we previously thought it was. And I think that most people would realise, with roughly a third of the population in the US actually having some form of relatively serious trauma. That being said, it's also on a sliding scale. There's different amounts of trauma, and I think that most people in society have undergone some degree of trauma, even if it's only a very small amount.
Okay, so and also another question he asked was that, and that this was interesting for me, is it like, well, if everyone has, who does not have trauma? Isn't life full of trauma? What are you talking about? Why you want to heal it? So it was interesting to me that the whole part of his perception and the reality is that that overwhelming presence of trauma is so prevalent that there is no living without it. So what is the problem? As if you are just being a crybaby, and you're just talking about something which is just the most fundamental part of existence.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things is acceptance of traumatic experiences that have happened to you, rather than fighting against them. And I think that that your friend is quite right. Trauma is part of life. Negative experiences, kind of sadness and upset, they're important parts of the human spectrum of emotion, and trauma happens to the vast majority of people in one way or another. I think that things like psychotherapy and potentially ayahuasca and psychedelic psychotherapy can allow you to view trauma, review the things that happen to you in a different way, and to allow you to work towards acceptance, or viewing it in a way that's less damaging to you. So a good example of this would be when you break down maladaptive coping mechanisms in relation to trauma. So say that you have somebody who was sexually abused by a middle-aged man when they were a child. They may develop a coping mechanism based around that abuse, and that could be to try and avoid all middle-aged men. And this could work really well, when you're 5. If you avoid middle-aged men, you're going to avoid the one who's been abusing you, and therefore, you'll avoid that repeated trauma. However, when you get a bit older and you need to catch the bus to go to college or to go to work or whatever, and if you're still trying to avoid all middle-aged men, then that's going to be really disruptive to your life, like incredibly disruptive. And so hopefully through something like ayahuasca or psychotherapy or psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, you could rethink the way that you thought about that trauma, and you could realize that that middle-aged man did something, unforgivable, but it wasn't your fault. That was not your fault. And you can realize and come to the understanding that, most middle-aged men, on the whole, are, they're okay. And then you can, get rid of that maladaptive coping mechanism. You can think about your trauma in a more objective way, and it can allow you to get on with, to move on with your life. A good way to think about the way that psychedelics act on the brain is that it makes you biologically ready for psychological change. It's a catalyst in the psychotherapy, and it does that through making your brain basically more malleable, more like putty, more easier to learn new things and to get out of old ways of thinking. And it does that by allowing new neuronal connections to be made in the brain more easily than it would be if you weren't on that psychedelic.
I think this is where it's brilliant that you gave this example, and I think that is why we should work with the trauma. It's a way or a message or a signal which tells us that there is a literally disconnection within your neurological circuits or whatever, or if you want to take it as subjective experience, you are not fully being in touch with your own self or instincts. And that is actually not only limiting you, as you're saying, the person cannot go about his life and truly experience the world the person lives in, but also it's actually painful in a way which is not necessary. So when if there's a whatever the issue would be, whatever the word you want to call it, and we call it trauma, it's because this is what the person needs to work on, and then it's just different for everyone, and it's on different levels. And once you work towards the trauma, it actually gives you some challenges which you work towards, and that it actually builds up your skills to deal with other life situations, and allows you to fully connect with yourself. When I say self or your body, I mean the world itself. It allows you to connect to your environment. Is this something, would you think it's a fair description?
Yeah, there's a really interesting book called The Body Keeps the Score that talks quite a lot about this. It's by a psychiatrist from, I can't remember where he's from. I think it was German, but grew up and moved to Holland or something. Anyway, he talks about how trauma is held in the body, and the importance of reconnecting to the body in order to help with those traumatic experiences. And that's it's I think it shows the way that psychiatry is moving at the moment, where we're beginning to move towards treatments such as EMDR, which is using eye movements to help to reprogram the brain. And then he talks about the importance of things such as yoga and neurofeedback, as well as other physical activities. So I think that my area of interest is definitely the kind of the psychedelics and the psychedelic psychotherapy, but there are a variety of ways out there as well to treat trauma, probably very much depending on the person and what appeals to you.
And this goes into same with Gabor Mate, and I think we should mention him because he's working a lot in childhood trauma and a lot of addiction field, and he talks about these two choices which you get, especially when you're a child. And I heard this in one of his talks where he mentions that when you were a kid, and especially a human child, well, to be more accurate, a Homo sapien child, one of the biggest thing is that we have an advantage by having bigger brains, that we rely strongly on our parents to take care of us for another like 2 to 3 years, and actually more, and every other
25 years.
If you're lucky. If you're lucky. I've seen 30-year-olds like Yeah. but but any other animal you see, they just like pop out and they can just run.
Yeah, yeah.
If you have seen any BBC Earth BBC documentary. But so what happens is that, well, if you're a child, you are evolutionary, biologically dependent for your life on your parents. So the association with your parents is actually not just an arbitrary thing, it's a survival requirement for you. So as a kid, you do understand slowly, even if you are very young, that the parents, even if you're 3-4 year old, are the people who keeps you alive. Now, and that is where the problem comes, where there's a choice. When you grow up, there's a choice between association for survival or your true self-expression and your genuine self-expression of who you are. And that is where your personality, your neural circuits, and your understanding of the worlds grow. And you can talk from an emotional, poetic point of view, or you can talk in this scenario from a neurological point of view. I'll mention both. And what we do always, nearly always, we sacrifice our self-expression because we rely on our parents or our close ones on association for survival. And that's one reason for the trauma. Now, we would think, oh, well, this is a very arbitrary issue, but not really, because it depends what kind of generational trauma is coming within the generation. This is not a statement of saying, oh, someone's parents are wrong, because we are not talking about one set of parents. We are talking about generation of parents after parents after parents. Means us, means everyone. Means that's where it would differentiate that what kind of traumatic experience your parents been through, and they're going to transfer that, unfortunately, genetically, epigenetically, or through these acts of like uncontrollable expression. And I think that's where the issue of childhood trauma becomes very dire and serious.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the epigenetics there. This is an area that's is beginning to gain quite a lot of attention, and in our current study, we were looking at epigenetic changes, and we were doing that through collecting samples of saliva. Now, epigenetics is the way that genetic material is expressed. So you have your genetic code, which is like the hardware, and then you have different proteins such as proteins called histones, and other things can happen to the DNA, like a methyl group gets added on, and that's almost like the software changes how certain genes are expressed. Now, studies are beginning to suggest that that our experiences change the way in which our DNA is expressed. So, for example, if you undergo a massive trauma, there was a study that was done looking at survivors from the Holocaust, then you have different expression of certain genes, for example, in response to stress. Now, what these studies are beginning to suggest is that even though you have undergone a stressful experience and your children haven't, so for the survivors of the Holocaust, they survived the Holocaust and their children didn't go into the Holocaust, their children were expressing the same stress response. Now, there are different explanations that could help to explain why that happened. So, for example, if your parent had been in the Holocaust, they would probably, or maybe they would tell you some stories, or you'd be aware of that, and so you'd be aware of that stress. But it appears to be more than that. It appears to be that the way that we live our lives right now will actually be reflected in our children and potentially our grandchildren's DNA. And so when you think of that from a traumatic point of view, the importance of really coming to accept your trauma, it can't be overestimated. It's a really key issue. People such as Gabor Mate and to a certain degree Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, Gabor especially really emphasizes the point that he believes that the majority of mental health comes from mental health problems come from some degree of trauma, like you were talking about before.
Yeah, and just to, I think I remember there are two more studies done with rats about the epigenetics. I think it was one about lemon, the smell of lemon, that wherever the I think there was some sort of unpleasant experience with the lemon, and then the kids just avoided lemon without even knowing that this happened. And then there was another story of, I think, on the other side, and that's what I want to talk to you about. That's where one of the key interest lies for me, is that they did a training for rats where they made them solve maze puzzles, and then the kids were just better in solving maze puzzles without even, like, I think generation, not generation remove, like one generation remove. Yeah. So the importance is that we can miss out that what tragedy a trauma would bring, not to one person but to whole society. And I think it's one of the biggest reason is that we are so hyper individualized that we do really believe in our DNA that a trauma of this person is the trauma of this person and this person only, but not of a society or a species itself. We don't think really that, I mean, we might know intellectually still, but we don't think that these kind of traumas and issues, which or symptoms of depression, which are, and I understand trauma and depression might be different in these kind of scenarios, but these symptoms are actually coming from what kind of overall social civilization issues or situations we are in, and these are symptoms of that in individual. But if we just talk about trauma and make it more simple, a trauma of an individual person allows them to keeps them away to connect to other people, but also it robs them of the potential we all know our consciousness, the life form itself have. And on epigenetics, if we know that the trauma can be passed on by generation, because this one study done by Robert Sapolsky, he's an endocrinologist, a very well respected biologist, also endocrinologist, but he did this a lot of studies on baboons, and he talks about that, someone 100 years ago in your heritage can have experienced famine, and that could affect you depending on wherever you are and how this thing affects you. I think if now we do have a chance to think about this, if we are not fighting for our survival and we are not getting re-traumatized, and we do have our chance to understand our trauma and not pass it on to our kids, but to do it the other way around, if we can connect better with the nature itself and these kind of hyper individualistic boundaries, and pass on a potential of being a better human. I mean, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, I think the nature connectedness is obviously a really key issue at the moment, and there's been a few studies that have come out recently. One of them by Dave Luke, looking at psychedelics and connectedness to nature, and finding that there's a correlation between the two, which is unsurprising. I think just going back to the epigenetics as well, it's probably worth saying that that the sample numbers used specifically in the study of Holocaust survivors is very small. So again, this isn't this is an idea. It's a theory that is supported by evidence rather than being what we know. But it definitely does hold a huge amount of weight, for sure. And for me, when I think about it, it feels like quite a lot of responsibility, thinking that, my diet could potentially affect my grandchildren. It's, yeah, it's definitely a way to get kind of racked with guilt for the rest of your life.
Well, I mean, yeah, definitely not guilt, more guilt. I mean, it's well, that's what I've heard, and I think with higher level of self-awareness, consciousness, more ability to be in the flow state and be more creative, I think that's the price. The price is that if you are paying attention, and that's what everyone talks about, that if you pay more attention to each and every moment passing by, you do understand that how much of the story you tell yourself and the illusions which keep certain the illusions which keep some of our control over the environment. We think how much control we have, it goes away, it dissolves. So the moment it dissolves, and if you still keep the attention on, and that is a one feature of psychedelic trip, is the initial resistance, because the problem is that we think we have control, and when it is revealed to you that what kind of control you think you have over the environment is a version of story you tell yourself to keep away from the this rawness of the experience. And yes, I think when we keep our attention to that point, it does, you would realize your mind tells you to tell you another story, or maybe, oh no, let's just maybe distract myself to an experience of binge watching or drugs or something. But still, if you are saying, we are trying to improve ourselves, so this is the price, that your attention is finally telling you all the time that how much of a responsibility and how much careful, unfortunately or fortunately, we have to be if we are living such a life, that your acts have such wide consequences. And maybe that's where meaning also pops in. That's why meaning is we have an epidemic of meaning right now.
Yeah, I think this is where some people would have some issues with the way that we treat mental health problems currently, for example, with antidepressants, where if you're feeling sad or you're feeling lonely or empty or anxious, instead of actually sitting down and thinking, why am I feeling like this, and going into yourself and trying to figure that out, you go to the GP and you get some tablets that allow you to jump back on the into the rat race and into the hamster wheel, and to carry on and quite potentially kind of miss what's actually going on inside. You're really putting a disconnect between you and your feelings and allowing yourself to continue. And that's really the opposite of what we're looking to do with psychedelics and psychedelic psychotherapy and ayahuasca. You're looking to connect to that, to figure out what that is, and then make appropriate changes, or even accept those feelings. And it'd be interesting to see if there's if that's represented in epigenetic changes as well, if we're actually dealing with the issues that are going on, rather than potentially just running away and burying them deep inside.
I mean, this is an experience which is not something so uncommon or unique, because always when I am having this profound experience, let's say, of some sort of epiphany or a very unique experience, according to me, of this deep uneasiness. I mean, it's just so funny, as unique as it sounds, and I write about it just as a treatment or therapy, or this is what I like to do, and accidentally happen to share it. And that is those experiences which nearly every person is like, oh yeah, I have this version of experience.
for
Oh, I
sure.
have this version of experience. And this tells me how much of certain, narratives of our identity, of our egoistic thinking, or certain specs of our psyche are much more complicated, and can actually completely disconnect you. Because, well, the resistance experience is very funny, because this is one step. This is the first step which allows you to get over this modern story of an individual only. I'm not saying individual does not have a value. I've grown up in a very collectivist society, and I understand there are huge negative impacts of anything if you're relying only on something like that. But the funny part was that because of some of the training, and because of some of these plans, the training of paying attention to these experiences helped me a little bit. But I mean, when the resistance come, when the uneasy, well, I call it difficult emotions, let's say, when the difficult emotion comes, which tells me that, oh, your identity, whichever story you have told you, is unfortunately it's not going to sustain now. It's over. You have to let go of your dead parts. I resist like a motherfucker. It's like, seriously, like whatever, like just whatever you want to call it. But the problem is that we might think when it is happening that it's some sort of weakness. It's like this is the state which we should avoid. But it's funny that kind of a heartbreak when you feel, if you are connected more of the time, and if you are paying attention to that part and not running away and not putting the distance, as you just mentioned, between your emotions and your sense of presence, you start to laugh sometimes at what kind of a tricks you're trying to pull on yourself to actually fix it. And that's the problem. Like, what are you trying to fix? Are you trying to fix the humanness of yourself? Or are you trying to fix that the only thing you can have is the good experiences, or whatever our hierarchy of experiences are? So the reason why I mention all of it is that it happens to actually most of us generally in different ways. So this is the story which I tell, and whatever the story everyone else would have of resistance, of telling story, of trying to hide away from it, it's that's why everyone resists sometimes in those kind of scenarios. And hopefully, if we are using these tools which allow you to look at these experiences more smoothly, I think the prospect of being in a harmony and being in chaotic experiences becomes much more understandable in our society, and that could help. I mean, so much that yeah, I don't know where the limit is.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about breaking down those defenses and those barriers that you have, that's why people can have such challenging experiences on psychedelics. And if you and the stronger those barriers are, the stronger those defense mechanisms are that you have, that's the more scary that it can be. And this is when we talk about ego dissolution. That's put it bluntly, almost your sense of self, the story that you've produced in order to protect yourself. And so that's why, especially when you first start taking psychedelic substances at high doses, many people report that they can be very scary, because whoever you think you are is taken away from you, and then you're just left with this objective reality without your story that you've told you to protect yourself. I think as well, it was interesting that you were saying whenever you have these moments of epiphany, which sounds like it happens to you quite a lot, Raza, but whenever you have those moments of epiphany, and when you speak to someone else about it, it's normally met with this kind of, oh yeah, no, I've experienced that too, which is curious, isn't it? I think that we live in a society that's becoming more and more fragmented and separate and individual due to technology, and we there are communities still exist, but we're moving away from that way of living. And I think we need to begin to question what price are we going to pay for that if we're going through all of these kinds of experiences without talking to our friends, our family, our community about them. Then that leaves you really isolated. And you think about Facebook, where it seems almost impossible to, from what I've seen on my Facebook feed, post anything other than pictures of people having an amazing time, which creates this impression that life everywhere apart from in your own home is this incredible experience where nothing ever goes wrong, and it's just not true. There's a whole spectrum of human emotion which is of vital importance: happiness and sadness, misery and ecstasy, and you can't begin to deny that. It's unhealthy. And if you begin to think that you should be aiming for this unrealistic life that will never exist, and that's the feedback that you get, then we're really in trouble.
Brilliant. Simon, thanks a lot for doing it. Is there any topic, because I can't top this, is there any topic you want to expand on?
I don't think so, but I mean, I just want to say that your cooking this evening was incredible. Yeah, sitting here in Raz's living room.
Perfect. No, you're invited anytime. You're welcome.
I will take you up on that.